Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Rukhsana Rahman from the Department of Women's Studies, Guwahati University. I'll be speaking on engendering these two very important concepts like war and peace. This will provide the students a theoretical understanding of conflict, women, and the gendered nature of conflict zones. This will also strengthen the knowledge of the students to go and to relate the feminist theories into the theories of international relations. There are many keywords that we are going to use in this module, that conflict, war, peace building, and gender. Now let us discuss with the introduction of engendering war and peace. In any analysis of conflict, what is often overlooked is the gender political dynamics. The focus of traditional security studies continues to be state-centric, and gender issues are relegated to the background. This privileging of national security becomes more apparent as the role of state diminishes in changes brought about by globalization. War and peace involve both men and women in specific ways. Therefore, to adequately address issues of peace, war, and security, one needs to understand specific mechanisms of gendered inclusion and exclusion. Involves both the material and the discursive levels of power relations, the gendered practices of states, and the construction of masculinities and femininities. Unless we take this into account, the root causes of violent conflict and their social and political context can neither be understood nor addressed in a transformative way. Wars, as understood in international relations theory, can be seen as products of systematic anarchy produced by the very structure of the international system. Second, anthropological approaches may explain war with the human potential for aggression and interest in securing power, fighting for political ideologies, and economic gain. Another approach attributes war to the domestic politics and internal structure that is undemocratic or weak of a state. Feminist thinking has provided further insight into this perspective based on analysis of the relationship between state behavior, gender justice, and democracy. Although the effects of war can sometimes reinforce stereotypical gender roles and ascriptions, on many occasions it is evident that they are challenged, altered, and at times completely reversed. The causes and reasons justifying wars have often been explained by scholars in terms of gender-based expectations of human behavior. War histories are often told in terms of brave, selfless men defending or saving pure, innocent, and naive women. Narratives about states, militaries, and their role in the international system are still based on gendered constructions. Gender role based on conceptions of masculinity and femininity reflect hierarchically structured relationships. It is therefore essential to highlight the importance of a gendered analysis of political processes and identity formation in the context of war and peace. Gender serves as a comprehensive and interdisciplinary analytical tool for understanding the relationship between social and cultural constructions of gender identity and conceptions of war and peace. The gender roles, which are often the product of historical, social, and cultural developments, have created stereotypes that inform both the discourse and practice. Aggression and courage are attributed to man, while pacifism to women. This is again social construction of masculinity and the femininity. This is perhaps more sharply reflected during times of war, where women are considered disadvantaged in comparison to men on physical attributes. While men, women, boys and girls experience similar phenomena during and after conflict, their experiences and levels of vulnerability are influenced by their gender and vary considerably. They are differently embodied, symbolize different things to their communities and those that attack them, are targeted differently, and their injuries have different social and livelihood impacts. They have different responsibilities in their families and communities and thus end up in harm's way differently. They have different livelihoods and ability to claim, own and inherent property, all of which impact the resources they can access to aid their survival and recovery. It is important to note the changing trends in gender roles in wars. First, women's representation in state militaries, armed rebellion groups and terrorist organizations have increased in recent years. Women took part in anti-colonial liberation struggles in Algeria or in guerrilla groups such as in Nicaragua, El Salvador and Guatemala. In intrastate conflicts in Africa, for example, in Liberia and Sierra Leone, women served as combatants even though they did not take on leadership roles and were not involved in direct combat. The problematic of the portrayal of women as peaceful and men as violent needs to be explored, as the ever-increasing presence of women in conflict across Africa and elsewhere demonstrates that the war is not an exclusive male passion and women are not necessarily always peaceful. The battlefield continues to be understood and analyzed as a male passion. Female combatants remain on the margins of war-related discourses. War is understood as a masculine endeavor for which women may serve as victims, spectators, or prizes. Conventionally, women's engagement with violence has been dubbed as unnatural, abnormal, perverse, or distorted. Even today, women continue to be studied largely as peacemakers and peace lovers, despite female combatants attracting significant attention. Women's engagement with violence brings for them a unique mixed experience of empowerment and exploitation also. The discourse that men fight wars to protect women has been a key determinant in legitimizing women's invisibility in war. However, what would be the question when the protected assumes the role of protector, that is, when women engage in fighting? Men and women share unequal relationships both during times of peace and war. women not only bear the consequences of violence unequally as protected persons, but also as protectors. During armed conflict, female combatants continue to remain susceptible to patriarchal control. By becoming agents of violence, women do not necessarily become immune to gender-based discrimination. Therefore, women's increasing presence in the military does not change the fundamental gendered construction of the institution, which at its core is coercive, hierarchical, and patriarchal. There are few questions which have therefore arises. Can women be more masculinized than men? Has war become any less violent because of inclusion of militarized women? And accordingly, to answer these above mentioned questions, we have found that any understanding of the relationship of women to war cannot be furthered without an analysis of the social construction of gender and its relationship to political processes and the advent of war. Feminists have questioned the narrow concepts of war making and or peace building. There might well be a state of peace between states, but if a state cannot provide for the security of all citizens, violence is privatized, quote unquote, and security is only provided for some parts of a society. Thus, war or violence in this perspective is not limited to enduring collective violence between states or organized groups. Violence can indeed be used as a means of enacting individuality. All of these structures and practices are deeply gendered. For example, in most societies, the ability to use violence is attributed to the male gender. Manliness, quote unquote, thus becomes visible when men use violence. In this context, violence is mostly taught in two ways. First, as direct physical violence, the absence of such violence and the absence of any imminent threat of it has been called negative peace. Secondly, there is a much broader range of violence, including structural, symbolic, and cultural violence. Structural violence exists whenever the potential development of an individual or group is diminished. For example, by uneven distribution of power and resources. The absence of these non-indirect, non-physical types of violence is a precondition for realizing comprehensive visions of positive peace, quote unquote. Violent conflict in Rwanda and former Yugoslavia provided a historical context for United Nations resolutions providing institutional recognition of sexual violence against women. This gendered understanding of sexual violence in the context of conflict, as for example, rape as a violence that only happens to women, reinforces the socially constructed distinctions and often puts men to disadvantage. The UN resolutions related to gender and security, the Rome Statute of International Criminal Court recognizing rape, forced sexual slavery and prostitution, and the International Criminal Tribunal on Rwanda establishing rape as a war crime mark a monumental step in the direction of gender equality. However, all these legal measures and provisions fail to address the ideological structures that support construction of different roles of men and women in times of conflict. The focus of gendered binary and conventional roles of men and women, where men are seen as active combatants and women as passive agents, inform much of the current discourse. One of the problems of the United Nations Resolutions 1325 is that it tends to use gender and women interchangeably and therefore does not see the interconnectedness of men's and women's lives. It is necessary to consider the connections between 1325 and men's and boys' roles in security and development. Another underlying assumption is that women's participation in the security and development process will help transform gender inequalities. But women in positions of power, by virtue of being women, cannot be assumed more likely to promote gender equality. Now let us discuss something about feminization of peace processes. Feminization of peace process. Women are key actors in setting the parameters for sustainable peace. Sexual, gender-based violence against civilian populations has emerged as one of the motivating factors for the intervention of the international community to end protracted conflicts in Africa. Also, the feminization of peace processes and of what women do in wartime has also influenced the emergence of women's peace activism. Like war, peace is gendered. While men dominate in the formal peace talks, women are more concerned with the socio-economic, humanitarian, and domestic familial issues in the aftermath of war. Gender and power are intertwined. Power is an essential feature of society and one that maintains relations of domination and subordination between groups of people. Violence and peace are not binaries or mutually exclusive categories. When mainstream IR scholars talk about peace, they ignore the wars going inside the home in the form of domestic violence. That means this kind of war and peace is not only affecting public but also in the private sphere. Gender dichotomy of women and peace, quote unquote, and men, war and violence, quote unquote, is inherently hierarchical in nature. International politics has long been conducted with stereotypes of a peaceful or weak woman and an aggressive man. The idea of feminine peace, quote unquote, has also been used to assert that women as compared to men are less prone to belligerent tendencies. In a similar vein, Fukuyama calls this the matriarchal world, quote unquote, which is more conciliatory and cooperative also. On the contrary, when women are militarized, it becomes easier for them to be acceptable to militarist state institutions. For example, in 2002, Condoleezza Rice, National Security Advisor to US President Bush, was described as Bush's secret weapon, quote unquote, as someone who, since September 11, had emerged as one of the most prominent and hawkish strategists in the US war on terrorism. Points out that such policies tend to naturalize or legitimize the politics of masculinity. For instance, when India conducted its first nuclear test, someone described it as India losing her virginity, quote unquote, while some expressed the desire that their baby would be a successful boy, not a failure girl. That again depicts the masculinist understanding of war and peace. Similarly, female members of the dominant ethno-political or social class may have as much interest in the escalation and the maintenance of violence as men. Like men, they may be driven by greed and grievance, by the belief in ideologies, or the struggle for personal gains in power and money. Women may be active or passive supporters of militarized masculinities and therefore involved in maintaining a violent conflict culture. As soldiers, nurses, suppliers, weapon producers and smugglers, women also actively sustain armed conflict. In his analysis on how gender shapes war systems and in the making of militarized masculinity, Goldstein contends that just as Hegel's beautiful soul, quote unquote, protects, I quote, the appearance of purity by cultivating innocence, unquote, about the cruel world, women's dominance in household sphere creates a kind of metaphysical refuge for traumatized soldier, a counterweight a hellish war. Although this gendering of psychological spheres, he argues, does not seem sufficient to account for gendered war roles, it reinforces peace processes. Hierarchies among masculinities involving race and class as manifest in military service are further evidence that gender is as rooted in social construct as it is in biology. The Vietnam War, for example, made more evident the relationship between gender and the institution of war and demonstrated the possibility that both gender inequality and war are amenable to change through socialization and education. During the Vietnam War, for example, while middle-class American men could forestall, even avoid going to war by going to college, upon graduation, the privileged were more likely to gain important positions in society. The poor who served in the military often returned to a jobless civilian life. The gendered nature of various institutions and other social arrangements exposes the power and subordination arrangements of patriarchy as one that exists and is sustained largely through the unequal status of men and women. Feminist theories on conflict and security have also challenged the traditional understanding of peace agreements brokered with militias, warlords and others who must be placated and given roles in the new order, often leading to the marginalization of women in the very peace process. Since peace negotiations are understood to be about the politics of the conflict and the violence associated with it, focus on women's peacefulness and victimization often excludes them from the negotiating tables. Such a portrayal of women as natural peacemakers puts them in need of protection within the security discourse instead of equal partners with transformative potential. 。 Therefore, peace needs to be understood as a process of conflict resolution and reconciliation. Including women in the peace process should not confirm the stereotypes of women as peaceful, quote unquote, and men as warlike, quote unquote. Most states and militaries define achievement of a ceasefire as the goal of peacemaking. However, peace is not only the end of conflict, but also on how to prevent new conflicts in war-torn countries. Societies where there is gender equality are less likely to militarize again. The issue of the Northeast is a thorny one, and the government of India sees sexual assault against women in the Northeast as collateral damage, says Vinayalakshmi Neopram, founder Manipur Women Gun Survivors Network. Neopram's organization documented 200 cases of violence against women in the region, of which 30% was perpetrated by defense personnel. Attempts to get information about the number of cases of violence against women alleged by armed forces through the Right to Information Act were thwarted by the central government on the ground that it would breach national security. So it often leads us to the question, whose security are we talking about? Militarization and violence against women has firmly established that the intersection of militarization and violence against women exacerbates structural inequality. As noted by Center for Women's Global Leadership (CWGL) on the launch of a 2010 campaign against gender violence, I quote, "To leave militaristic ways of thinking unchallenged is to leave certain forms of masculinity privileged, to leave global hierarchies of power firmly in place, to grant impunity to wartime perpetrators of violence against women," unquote. On one level, when a predominantly male military body is strongly integrated into the political and civic culture of a country, most female participation and representation in government is precluded, and women-related issues become more politically marginalized than usual. The allegations made by the Kunan Poshpora village in Jammu and Kashmir against the Indian Army steers such as deep-seated structural deformities. There are some references of the security studies, armed conflict, all-male field, peace studies as an academic field engage women, discourses of war and peace are highly gendered, like war is related to men, peace is related to women. Now let us discuss about something gendered peace index. Clason in 2006 developed a gendered peace index to measure the degree of peacefulness of a society based on a process-oriented conception of peace. This means that peace is not a given status or defined aim, but has to be continuously created through social processes that are open to change. Clason defines three conditions for peace. UN Security Council resolutions on gender and security. SCR 1325 October 2001, it is the first UNSC resolution to link women in conflict to maintenance of international peace and security. It calls for increased role and number of women in conflict prevention, peace building and reconstruction of a just society. SCR 1820 in the year June 2008 recognizes conflict-related sexual violence as a tactic of warfare. Its avoidance identifies as a critical component of the maintenance of international peace and security. SCR 1888 in September 2009 calls for strengthening tools to implement 1820 through assigning leadership, building judicial response expertise, and reporting mechanisms. SCR 1889 in the year October 2009 addresses women's exclusion from early recovery and peace building and lack of adequate planning and funding for their needs. With this, we have come to an end of the discussion of war and peace, and there are different ways how to engender these two important theoretical tools of war and peace. Thank you.